Today let's talk pain, poison and twisted flesh creations with an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of every Drukhari unit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the Dark Eldar, and I thought a bit over a year down the line it might be good to revisit the units in the Codex in their entirety, seeing as so much has changed for the Drukhari over this time between points nerfs, rule changes and more. As we've done with a fair few other armies in 40k, in this review we're going to be talking over each and every unit from Codex Drukhari, talking about a few of their strengths and weaknesses, both in the game and in relation to their peers, reasons that you might want to field them or not field them in a force. I would start out by saying though that I think that Drukhari have one of the single best internally balanced codexes out of all of 9th edition. There's certainly some stuff that's stronger than others, but I'd argue that literally every unit remains usable, at least to some niche level, and I think you're very rarely going to be holding yourself back significantly by including any one thing in your force alongside a greater mix of units. In the video we'll go through the strengths and weaknesses of each unit and give them a rough score out of 10 as to how strong I think they are in game right now, though I've basically not chosen to score anything particularly low, as I think even the worst units aren't particularly far behind their peers, and they do have uses if you want to make them work. Loads to talk through then, so let's jump straight in, starting with the troops, and then we'll go through the other sections of the codex in turn. First up we have the Kabbalite Warriors, perhaps the archetypical troop choice with the splinter rifles, 8 points per model, and available in small flexible squads to pack a bit of ranged punch. Being troops, they're a core unit so get buffs well, and they're basically the troop choice that you want if you want to have a bit of fire support. Cheap squads of them, maybe with a blaster, can be pretty efficient when they're zipping around in Venoms or Raiders. Their durability isn't terrible for toughness 3 infantry either, the 4+ armor save helped and it's quite good in light cover, though I'd still say that they aren't particularly tough even with power from pain, and if you are comparing them to racks they will go down a bit easier. Other good things are their blasters and lances are pretty good for the cabals with single rerolls, and if you're feeling a bit spendy and want a retinue for your Archon, you can upgrade them to Trueborn. The 2+ ballistic skill ignoring modifiers is really quite nice, but you will have to pay a premium for it, so I sort of still feel you're getting what you're paying for. On the downside, they're not going to do anything much in melee besides against the lightest infantry, even with 2 attacks. The poison damage from their splinter rifles can be good against some, particularly tough monstrous creatures with bad saves, but it's underwhelming against a lot of the field. And if you are looking for cheap durable troops with obsec and transports, racks do arguably do the job a bit better. Next up we have the Witches, enormously strong when they were 10 points per model, but nerfed a bit going up to 12. They now feel a little bit less of a throwaway disposable threat, and the high points cost does hurt them. Again, they're a core unit for good buffs, and they are pretty efficient at clearing out infantry with a multitude of strength 4 damage -1 attacks, though I guess that has been hurt a bit into Space Marines with Armour of Contempt. In melee they do get a bunch of fun tricks, they're fairly annoying to kill with their 4+ invuls, and they have the chance to prevent fallback, which is quite nice. A lot of people like to run them in Cult of Strife if you're running big witch squads. That gives you access to some seriously nice options like ignoring Overwatch or getting buffs to wound with their mass attacks. As the dedicated melee troops, it's quite nice they have a long threat range, move 8 inches, advance with power from pain turn 2 and charge, and they can be halfway across the table in a single turn. Pretty nice for charging down enemy objective holders, hopefully killing them, and then claiming the objective for the Darkkin. Unit wise, I still think that they can be worth it as a bit of a luxury buy, but they are a bit pricey compared with the other troops now, and they are very fragile against ranged damage once they're exposed. Plus, as melee units, struggling versus hard targets isn't the best. High armor saves or high toughness values can make them a lot less useful. Overall, I've scored them a 7 out of 10. I feel they're a bit more niche than the Kabbalite Warriors, though still a squad or two could be handy enough in small numbers. Finally, for the troop section, we have the Racks, again 8 points per model, and perhaps the best out of the 3 of them at the moment. Being a cheap core unit that's the toughest out of the 3 is a big selling point just in themselves. They're great choices for parking on an objective and just holding it down as best as they can. If you've got a homunculus nearby, then even better, they'll be toughness 5 and get to regenerate models with those healing abilities. On top of that, their melee point for point really isn't significantly behind the Witches, particularly as their weapons get poison as well. And the squad upgrades seem very good value just for the cheap 5 points that they cost, particularly in Dark Technomancers. Things like Hex Rifles are genuinely good sniper weapons, and most of the other upgrades are kind of okay as well. Finally, compared with the others, they can also be much more viable in really quite big units as well. A unit of 10 supported Hemoxites is even tougher than standard with better invuls and also ignoring damage each turn. And you can take a very heavy rack skew list with Homunculi giving you mass toughness 5 racks, and with their feel no pain and things they can be really hard to remove from objectives. Perhaps the main downside is no shooting and their melee damage is only really all that good against light infantry. But for cheap, tough objective holders, getting any damage output in the first place is quite a nice thing. I'd say they're one of the stronger units in the whole codex, and I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Transport's next, and the sturdy raider is 100 points base now, having suffered multiple points nerfs, including having the disintegrator cheaper than the Dark Lance. Transports in general are still going to be a pretty staple thing in Drukhari, and raiders are the ones to go for if you want a decent amount of transport capacity for the points, as they have 11 slots as opposed to the 6 for the Venom. It's got great mobility, you can charge out of it and shoot out of it, and it works great with any particularly fragile, hard-hitting infantry, things like Incubi. It'll also do a small amount of fire support, it's one of the better places to run disintegrators if you want them, has a 5+ invul so it will shrug off some anti-tank weapons, and some of the vehicle upgrades are pretty good as well. Grizzly trophies can be a very cheap way to get leadership shenanigans on the go, and the shock prow could allow you to do a drive-by mortal wound trick. When it's done its transport delivering, having a cheap and moderately tough vehicle just to throw onto objectives as a disposable objective grabber isn't bad at all. Overall, I think the raiders are very solid, though with the increased costs I think aren't quite as auto-include to spam loads of them anymore. You certainly still can field entire raider-born armies, but I feel like a lot of lists tend to be a bit more mix and match, more like running 2 or 3 rather than 5 or 6. Overall, I'd score them an 8 out of 10, a very solid transport indeed. Next up we have the Venom, 75 points to the Raider's 100, again pretty cheap for a transport vehicle and even faster than a Raider with 16-inch move. I feel like the fire support is kind of equivalent that it brings for the points, obviously a lot more geared towards infantry with splinter cannons and rifles, and despite having a relatively fragile wound count, a 5+ invul and -1 to hit at range both help out a lot. Perhaps the biggest downsides are that you don't get as many transport slots for the points, you only have 6 of them, the damage output can be really underwhelming against heavily armoured armies or vehicles, and 6 wounds will fold a bit easier than the Raider if you do catch it in combat or the -1 to hit is negated in other ways. In general though, I think it's pretty comparable to the Raider strength wise. I'd score it an 8 out of 10. A good transport for smaller squads, maybe particularly ones that are venturing towards far-flung objectives. Into the elite section next, and we'll start out with the Court of the Archon. You need at least 4 of these, and they cost between 16 to 22 points per model, so 64 points will be the cheapest squad you can field. I'd say perhaps their best role is just being a surprisingly sturdy objective grabber squad. Both the Slith and the Urgul have 3 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain, which isn't bad at all for 16 or 18 points. It's a fairly decent way of concentrating more defense in a transport as well, as they still only take up 1 slot. As well as being tough, they're relatively fast even compared with other Drukhari with an 8-inch move, can bully light infantry really quite well. The Urgul, for example, gets 6 attacks on the charge at strength 4 AP -1. They can help protect the Archon, and they're slotless if there's an Archon about. Perhaps their main weakness is that they're not some of the best damage dealers in the Codex, they mainly bring durability, they don't get obsec, and you can't spam them without taking multiple Archons, so you'll often only see 1 unit in a list. Overall though, I think they're a very usable, sturdy unit, and I'd score them an 8 out of 10. Next up in the elites we have the Grotesques, 35 points per model of melee rage. They went down a bit in the last Drukhari points adjustment, and being the biggest and chunkiest core Covens units now that the Pain Engines lost it, they're pretty much the scariest synergy piece that they have now. I think there's a lot to like about Grotesques. They're very tough with toughness 5, 4 wounds and a feel no pain. Their melee is very solid and general purpose, with 4 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2. They've got a very good threat range with 7-inch movement and advance and charge from turn 2, and they work particularly nicely with the Artists of Flesh custom coven. It really amps up their durability, and they're a lot more likely to feel the pain of things like strength 6 or 7 weapons that have multi-damage. If you need to turn up the heat in melee as well, they have a stratagem to allow you to reroll wound rolls, which with strength 5 and damage 2 is excellent. There's not a lot that wants to get in the way of that profile when you get to reroll wounds. As for downsides, it can be a bit annoying that they're bulkier for transports, meaning that you're going to have to pay more cost to transport them if you want to, and some targets they're not particularly efficient against, as with any damage 2 stuff, damage -1 weapons really punishes them. as do very high armor saves such as Armor of Contempt Terminators. Still though, they're very popular in competitive lists at the moment. They're very nice, fast, durable melee powerhouses. I'd score them a 9 out of 10. On the other hand though, if you want your melee more deadly but a bit more disposable, then you have the Incubi. 18 points per model for a Blade for Hire in power armor. These guys have got crazy general purpose melee damage that makes short work of most things. A whole bunch of attacks hitting on 2s with strength 5, AP minus 3 and 2 damage. They get more damage and Blade Artists on 6s, and the Clavex's Demi-Claves have the option to be a bit more efficient against hordes. On top of that, their Tormentor's ability can be really quite powerful when it comes into effect meaningfully. You have the chance to make enemy units fight last if they fail an old school morale test, and if that ever stops the enemy from interrupting and killing a whole squad dead, then it'll be absolutely worth its weight in gold. As well as that, they work excellently alongside the melee powerhouse that is Drazar. Plus 1 to wound alongside strength 5 makes them yet more ferocious. As for downsides, what you see on the profile is what they get. They don't get sub-faction bonuses or things as their Blades for Hire, and despite their 3+ armor save, having just 1 wound and toughness 3 means they are very fragile for 18 points. Damage 1 weapons with a bit of AP will cut them down quickly, though hopefully they're cheap enough that most of the time they're going to be able to trade up for something more valuable. Overall, I still think they're really strong, particularly next to Drazar for the buffs, and I'd score them a 9 out of 10. Next up, we come to the Shadowy Mandrakes, 15 points per model, and for the most part the question of whether or not you want to use them is if you want to pay the premium for the forward deployment options and screen out some of the midfield for 75 points. Certainly can be handy against some armies, particularly if they have their own infiltrators, and once they're there they might well be able to do a few other interesting things too. Between their Bale Blasts and their Blades, they can cut down a fair few light infantry at close range. They're at least a little bit annoying to remove with a -1 to hit and a 5+ invul baked in, and they do have the useful fade away rule, which means they can disappear and pop up somewhere later. Could be handy for doing a bit of retrieving data later in the game maybe. Still though, I think the main reason that you'd want to include them is for the forward deployment. Their damage output just isn't really that great, and they're still very flimsy despite those special rules, and again they don't get any sub-faction bonuses being Blades for Hire. Despite that, I still think that zoning out the midfield can be worth it. I might take a unit or maybe 2, but certainly not more. But for their role, I would score them an 8 out of 10. Employing them for a bit of board control certainly can be a price worth paying. Next up, we come to perhaps one of my least favourite units of the book. The Beastmaster is an elite's choice for 40 points per model, and kind of needs to be considered with the beasts really, which we'll get onto in a second, as he's basically a tax unit to get your hands on those. His damage and defense are both pretty bad, but having a cheap 40-point character running around can just be an advantage all of itself. If you need a complete expendable threat to throw onto an uncontested objective, then he can always do a bit of dying that way. You could give him the Animus Vitae grenade. He's not going to care about getting right up to the enemy and throwing the mortal wounds at them, and advance your entire army to the next round of Power from Pain a turn early. And if you are actually running him as Games Workshop intends and run him alongside the beasts, he does provide extra morale, rerolls of 1 in combat, and also advance and charge to some of the beasts, so I guess solid enough if you are running some medium-sized packs that you actually want to buff like that. Still though, beasts in general aren't a massively popular pick either, perhaps because other units can do a fairly similar job and not have to bring this guy along as a tax. Speaking of which, we have the beasts, 3 different units in the fast attack choices, the Fiends for 25 points, the cheap Chimerae for 10, and 12 points for the Razorwing Flocks, and for 1 Beastmaster you can take 3 of these units along. They're all really quite cheap, and I think that they all do at least have an interesting niche. The Chimerae are notable because you can take just 2 of them at 20 points, so you can have a super cheap and incredibly expendable fast moving threat. If anything is going to do a bit of screening or dying exposed on objectives, then a 20-point dog unit is something that you can easily sacrifice. And for 10 points, having a toughness of 4 and a 5+ invul isn't actually all that bad durability for something fairly fast. The Razor Wings are only 12 points, and despite a toughness of 2, their durability is even better. Just having 4 wounds means they're going to be somewhat annoying to remove, and again you could throw them onto objectives. The base entry of the squad is a bit more expensive at 36 points, but still cheaper than most units. Perhaps their major downside is that if you're using them en masse, it makes it a bit easier to get that objective for killing wounds worth of enemy units. Plus they really do little to no damage in combat, only having a strength of 2. Finally, the Claw Fiends are like cut-price grotesques at 25 points per model. They move nicely fast at 10 inches, have strength 5, AP -2 and 2 damage, and 5 attacks hitting on 4s. They're at least relatively hard to shift for the 25 points at toughness 5, 4 wounds, and a 5+ save. And again, you could have them as very cheap, little expendable units at just a single one for 25 points. I think as they go just for their raw stats, for the damage and defense, they're all quite cheap compared with the rest of the codex, though all have their downsides in having very low leadership if they're not near the Beastmaster, maybe not significantly better than other units that can do the similar roles. They don't get sub-faction bonuses, and you do have to bring that Beastmaster tax along, who makes the very cheap cost of these just a little bit less appealing. They don't see a fat lot of competitive play, but I do feel that just as cheap little disruption units, they may be a tiny bit underrated. Perhaps you could pick up some cheap clawed fiends to run alongside the Beastmaster, give the Beastmaster the Animus Vitae so is buffing the whole army, and then pick up a couple of the very expendable Chimerae or Razor Wings just to be disposable screens or sacrificial units. Overall, I've ranked them a 7 out of 10. I think they're dragged down mainly by having to be paired with the Beastmaster. Moving on, we come to the Hellions, 17 points per model, and certainly one of the biggest winners when translating from the previous codex to this one, gaining massively in terms of durability and attack. They're just generally quite an all-round solidly powerful unit, a very fast melee threat with 14-inch movement and maybe advance and charge round 2, a little bit of anti-infantry fire with their splinter pods, and then quite broadly effective damage to melee with AP-1 and blade artists, which en masse should be able to tear apart the majority of units of the game, even if just by stacking saves. They get a built-in fallback and charge, which is quite nice, have a useful flyby stratagem for some mortal wounds, and as with the other witch units, can get some very good stratagems from Court of Strife. Rerolling the wound roll against toughness 5 or better can massively up the damage. In terms of weaknesses, I feel they're perhaps a little bit less good at being general purpose than they were. Damage -1 abilities like Death Guard or Duty Eternal always hurt damage 2 weapons, and now Armor of Contempt is a thing, it makes AP-1 not the best place to be against Marines. While their defense isn't too bad against most things, damage 2 weapons en masse will absolutely obliterate them. You really don't want to get these guys shot by heavy bolters. It also does mean that you might need to commit to a witch patrol as well, so I guess it depends on how many other cult units you're using in the army. Still though, generally solid stats, with a decent amount of support options, and even faster than the majority of Drukhari, means that I think they're very solid, and I've ranked them an 8 out of 10. Next up we come to their rivals, the Reavers. Again, fast attack and 20 points per model this time. The zippy jet bikes do compare pretty similar to the Hellions on a few different things. Perhaps the main difference is that Reavers take speed to a whole extra level, they get an 8-inch move when advancing, and if they charge after that, that means they have a crazy threat range. But their damage is generally a bit more skewed to the shooting phase, perhaps a bit more tempted to take things like blasters or heat lances. Their blade veins still will kill light infantry fairly efficiently though, and they can up the melee threat a bit by taking a Grav Talon along. In general, I'd say that Reavers are maybe a bit better as small numbers as a potential big scary long range threat, but I feel that when they commit they often don't do quite as much damage or be quite as devastating as you might have hoped on paper, maybe holding up an objective or killing something weak for a turn before being removed fairly easily as it goes. As with Hellions as well, damage 2 weapons will kill them pretty fast. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10, maybe I feel they're just a little bit more niche than the general purpose Hellions, but still solid enough for their crazy threat range, they just pay a bit of a premium for their speed. Moving on, we get to the Scourges, the winged Drukhari with the heavy and special weapons. They're 12 points per model before upgrades with their shard carbines, and could be basically run in 2 different ways, either deep striking or fast moving special weapon delivery, maybe blasters for anti-tank or shredders for anti-infantry, or maybe just run very cheap and just used as a pop-up unit for things like retrieve Nachman data. They do get a little bit of a toughness boost from their 5+ invol armor as well, which doesn't hurt. On the other hand though, they are blades for hire, so no sub-faction bonuses for them. I suppose you could get some re-rolls with their Real Space Raid Archon, I guess. The 5+ invol save doesn't stop them from being hideously fragile as soon as they are exposed to enemy counter-attacks, and for the heavy special weapon options they might struggle to do enough damage to really justify their points cost with their Alpha Strike, so I'd probably not be using them en masse for heavy damage dealing, more as a precision tool to maybe try and delete the single most important thing in the opponent's army, even if it's going to cost you a fair amount of points to do so. Overall, I'd probably rank them somewhere between a high 7 or a low 8. Definitely usable either for special weapons or actions, very fast when they're on the board, but also a bit on the pricey side. Moving into heavy support next, and we have the archetypical heavy support of the Ravager, 130 points with the Dark Lances or 145 with Disintegrators. Basically, it's just a very efficient source of dark lance fire, and the very big powerful shots work pretty well in Blackheart with their single reroll. Not really a whole ton to say about this. If you want a bit of efficient and fast moving, long ranged anti tank added to the army, then the Ravager works well. A lot of people seem to use one or two, but rarely spam three of them. It's sometimes just handy to have a unit that can reach out and strike down enemy vehicles at long range. In terms of weaknesses, obviously it's not going to really enjoy being in melee. You don't really want to have to pay the stratagem to fall back and shoot. And in particular, like a lot of Drukhari vehicles, things like autocannon fire with strength 7 or 8 and damage 2 or 3 will make a big mess of them, so best to try and avoid that if possible. Overall, quite a nice little gun platform though. High AP, damage D3 plus 3 firepower is really good against a lot of targets. I've scored it an 8 out of 10. Next up we have the pain engines of the Covens. First up the Talos for 100 points base. Can be a bit more expensive if taking the liquefier gun or the injector. These were certainly very strong when they were core and could get the +1 toughness. Plus they worked really nicely against anti-tank weapons when they got -1 damage against everything from the custom Coven, but that one was nerfed to work against only strength 7 or less, so it doesn't hurt the things that perhaps most want to target the Talos. Despite the slight nerfs, they are decently tough though. The 5+ feel no pain and invuls mean that they don't go down too easy. They can pack a fairly dangerous sting in the tail with their heat lance anti-tank fire, and have pretty nice general purpose melee with things like macro scalpels, Talos gauntlets, or Ichor injectors. The Ichor injector giving you a pretty reasonable chance of punching through D3 mortal wounds. They do have quite a lot less synergy than they used to have, but can still access a few things such as healing from nearby homunculi, or the Torturer's Craft stratagem that allows you to reroll wound rolls in combat. Certainly could be powerful if you've got more than one Talos in a squad. Overall, I'd say that they're fairly well balanced for the points now. Still a pretty reasonable unit to have at the heart of the Drukhari battle line. Reasonable threat range with their 8-inch movement, and maybe advance and charge if they need to. A little bit of shooting, and some fairly meaty melee. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. Lastly, for the heavy support, we have the Kronos. 75 points for a more buffing orientated pain engine. Being so much cheaper than the Talos for basically the same defensive profile, they are really hard to shift for the amount of points they cost. Perhaps their main weakness is that they really don't do all that much damage for the cost. Their melee is a little bit underwhelming, and they've kind of got a glorified heavy flamer as their primary ranged attack, but they do provide a bunch of handy buffs, such as the chance to resurrect slain models when they do kill things, buffing nearby units in melee with their spirit probe for reroll 1s to wounds, and if they wipe a unit, they might be able to put a unit into Power from Pain round 5 for 1 command point. If you do take them in Dark Technomancers though, they become a lot more general purpose. The Spirit Siphon's auto-hitting means that you can just overcharge them the entire time, getting damage to and +1 to wound, which makes them legitimately threatening, so you could afford to spam big numbers of them there if you wanted. Overall, not the most massive amount of direct damage, but useful as a buffing piece, really sturdy just to park on an objective and force your opponent to deal with it, and in Dark Technomancers they can be threatening in their own right. Very usable, and I've ranked them an 8 out of 10. Flyers next, and we have the Razor Wing and the Void Raven. The Razor Wing went down slightly in cost from when it initially dropped, 150 points base, and as a flyer it's got all their usual strengths and weaknesses, massive speed so you can often get lines of sight on things that you wouldn't normally, can be quite good for engage on all fronts and positioning type secondaries, but doesn't really have any interaction on objectives and can perhaps be one of the easier units to ignore if you need to. Perhaps its main issue is that its firepower is just merely okay, and not quite as threatening for the points as the Ravager's Dark Lancers. Certainly not bad, just pays a premium to get the hits on exactly what it needs to. Though in general I think people don't play as many of the planes just because speed isn't really something that Drukhari are normally lacking for. They've got quite a few options that can hurtle across the table at ridiculous paces and get into the areas that they need to. In general, I'd say it's a similar story for the Void Raven. It's got fairly similar firepower for the cost, the Lancers getting upgraded to Void Lancers to hit a bit harder, and it can take some missiles on top of that if you want to. Otherwise it just seems very similar to the Razor Wing. The main choice is whether or not you pay the extra points cost to get the big mortal wound bomb, which is potentially rather threatening indeed, giving you a chance to do d6 mortal wounds to every unit within 6 inches on the roll of a 4+. If the enemy does cluster up a little and you can get that off on multiple decent targets, you could make the investment back then and there, but it can be super swingy. If you just don't roll a whole load of those 4+, then you're not going to do any damage at all. Overall, I feel it's fairly balanced against the Razor Wing. Whether you want more of just a cheap gun platform or more or less the same thing plus the bomb for a bit extra. I've chosen to rate it a 7 out of 10, definitely usable, though I'd still say not one of the strongest units. Talking of strongest units though, let's get into the HQ section, perhaps one of the most ferocious out of the entire book. First up we have the Archon, who's 70 points base, that you might upgrade him with Master Archon or a Blast Pistol, and I think he's very hard to go wrong with as a leader for your raiding parties. He just does a very decent amount of work for the points. He can grant some rerolls, potentially to other units as well if he happens to be in a real space raid, though perhaps the main reason that he's so valuable is that he's just got awesome traits and relics. The Gym Blade gives him a damage 3 weapon with high AP and a boatload of attacks, and then he can either combine it with the big rerolled hits and wound warlord trait, which means that he's going to be a fearsome force against anything in combat, or he can take Ancient Evil, the one that guarantees that the enemy fights last within 3 inches, and make him a good support piece both for his own melee and also any squads nearby. Then he can pay for the Master Archon upgrade that can allow him to fight twice once per game, again with a whole load of damage 3 attacks, that's no joke. He can have a cheap blast pistol for an accurate 2+ shots for a anti-tank weapon. He allows the option of Trueborn and the Court of the Archon, both of which I think are usable. And if you are getting lucky with the Shadow Field, he can be an absolute pain to remove, particularly resistant to very high AP, high damage weapons that might often cut through characters without issue. Overall, I think that the Archon's absolutely great. It's very hard to go wrong with one unless you aren't using any Cabals at all. Perhaps the biggest weaknesses are that the Shadow Field, while it can be great, can also be utterly terrible and fail instantly, and he's going to be a bit weaker to high toughness enemies that he might need to wound on a 5+. Still though, for raw value for the points between his command abilities, massive fighting damage, and maybe enemies fighting last or him fighting twice, he's an absolutely great choice to have jumping out of a raider alongside some other Drukhari hard hitters. Next up we come to the Succubus. Again, a spectacularly hard-hitting character when upgraded with a Warlord trait and relic, though she did see a bit of a points bump when the Drukhari got nerfed. If you want a cheap character that can basically solo the vast majority of an elite infantry squad by herself in a single round of combat, then the Succubus is likely to be a decent choice. There's quite a few reasonable melee builds for her, in addition to maybe another +1 attack from her combat drugs. You can take precision blows and the triptych whip for a whole load of damage to things and some mortal wounds on 6s. Or if you're in the Cult of Strife, you could take the combo of Grave Lotus Razor Flails and Competitive Edge for doubling down on the attacks. Again, they should stack a serious amount of saves on the opponent. Otherwise, she can buff witch units, can gain access to those powerful Cult of Strife stratagems, has the option to be a Master Succubus to consolidate out of combat and potentially hit the enemy without being hit herself, and also, as with the standard witches, can prevent fallbacks if your opponent is unlucky. Overall, she's very, very strong for the points cost, though needs a bit of screening and careful play for her not to be a one-hit wonder. I think often she perfectly can make her points back in a single round of combat, but if you can manage to screen her from being killed in that same turn, then she might be able to do it again. Perhaps one of the other main disadvantages of Succubi are that witch detachments tend to be a little less strong now following the points increases. Despite being a great blender for the points cost, they often do get passed up a little bit just to pack in more racks and things. Overall though, a really powerful gladiatorial fighter. I'd rank the Succubus a 9 out of 10. Lastly, for the core 3 HQs, we have the Homunculus, 70 points base, and rather than being an out-and-out melee murder machine, they're a bit more of a subtle presence that makes the troops tougher and also is annoyingly hard to put down himself for a character. They get their Feel No Pain, boosted toughness, and then if you've upgraded them to a Master Homunculus, they also get to stand back up again most of the time with Alchemical Maestro. He can give his +1 toughness boost to Racks and Grotesques, both of which will thank him for it. He can potentially be putting quite a lot of racks back on the table with the popular Warlord trait Twisted Animator, always good to be adding more durable bodies onto the objectives, and has a few other fun options such as the Crucible of Malediction stratagem to punish some Psychers, the Poisoner's Ampule to throw some mortal wounds and also turn off auras, and the Vexator Mask if you have Prophets of Flesh for another chance to fight last. In general, they're a very solid option for the cheap 70 points, and very tempting to put in army lists seeing as Covens are fairly strong right now. Perhaps the main weakness is slightly lackluster melee damage, though for a cheap and tough buffing character with a bit of healing, that's not the end of the world. I've chosen to rank him a 9 out of 10. Next up we come to the Master of Blades himself, Drazar, the most expensive Drukhari HQ by quite a long way at 145 points, and just has so many stacked stats that he is in near auto-include territory. A lot of people include him in lists of any flavour, and he's a very tempting pick for the Warlord as well. as he can take the same trait as the Archon, allowing him to reroll all hits and wounds in melee, as if his already great stats and fighting twice weren't enough. He's basically by head and shoulders the mightiest Drukhari combat character. 5 attacks at AP-3, damage 3 and +1 to wound, and then even extra damage on a 6, and a bit of extra AP from Blade Artists. Then when he's done that, he fights all over again, and if you haven't made him your Warlord, then as I said, he's rerolling all hits and wounds, so there's pretty much nothing in the game that really wants to stand in combat with him. He's also seriously tough for a Drukhari. -1 damage, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invul at least goes some way to make him not just removed trivially like the Succubus. Like the Incubi, he has the chance to make enemies fight last if they fail that leadership, and he makes the already decent Incubi into a true force to be reckoned with by giving them a +1 to wound bonus to their general purpose melee as well. Certainly pricey, but a crazy amount of damage for the cost still. Perhaps the biggest weakness is that even though he's tough for a character, he still is a character without that many wounds. If he's exposed, he isn't all that hard to shoot to death, and it's fairly painful to lose 145 points. Still though, certainly one of the Drukhari's most competitive units, I've chosen to score him a 10 out of 10. Next up we have Lilith Hesperax, a 90 points HQ choice, who following the points adjustment at least isn't so laughably outcompeted by standard Succubi, and she does have a few draws that might make you want to use her instead of them. She's basically a character that's tailored towards killing hordes and characters, a whole ton of strength 4, AP-3 and damage 1 attacks. She has the potential to fight twice if she kills any models with those, and she also gets to reroll hits and wounds versus characters, though only being damage 1 does have its downsides to assassinating powerful ones. As well as that, she has the built-in Master Succubus upgrade, so can hit enemies then dance away. She has the chance to prevent fallback, and can use the Cult of Strife stratagems as well. I guess my main criticisms are that she just seems far less general purpose and dangerous than the standard Succubi, and costs 10 points while doing so, although doesn't need as much investment in terms of Warlord traits or relics. I think that strength 4 and damage 1 just is a bit underwhelming, even if you have a lot of attacks and some bonuses with it. Against any sort of elite infantry with 3 wounds, you're really going to be struggling. Though I suppose if she's targeting things with -1 damage, at least it won't get worse. Personally, I think I'd much rather run the standard Succubus instead, and I've ranked Lilith a 7 out of 10. Finally for the HQ section, we have Urian Rakarth, the Prophet of Flesh unique homunculus, who costs 100 points, and is kind of an interesting side grade to the standard homunculi. I think he definitely does have his weaknesses. Being locked to the single coven is kind of annoying if you're not running it. Its warlord trait is bad, and you can't take any others or relics, which is maybe one of the main attractions to the standard homunculus. He does have a fair amount of just random extra buffs though, which might be enough to be worth the extra 30 points, and I sort of don't really feel he's too bad to have in the centre of the army doing things opportunistically. First up, as well as handing out toughness, he also gives +1 strength and leadership to Racks and Grotesques. I suppose it can help Racks bully toughness 3 infantry, but for Grotesques it could be quite meaningful on a fair few things, wounding things like toughness 5 Custodes on 3s for example. It means that if you are using him to buff some fighty homunculus coven units, he is kind of handy to have around. Otherwise he's got the built-in Master Homunculus, so probably stands up when he dies, is additionally tough compared with the standard homunculi, getting a mighty 4+ invul save and half damage, never mind all the other things like the feel no pain and the gets back up. And he's got a small shooting attack that's actually fairly dangerous to light infantry, 2d6 strength 3 hits at AP-2, will quite likely lead to a fair few casualties if you get to fire it at something toughness 3. In general though, I do feel he's a bit on the niche side compared with the standard homunculus. I don't think he's quite as strong as they are. Perhaps a maybe pick if you are running Prophets of Flesh, maybe as a second choice alongside a homunculus that you've already given the upgrades to. I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10 overall, and probably closer to a 7 than a 9. So that's the entirety of the Drukhari Codex summed up then. Just to finish up, I thought we'd very quickly touch on some of the non-Codex units. 2 sets from Codex Eldari, and 2 from Forge World. Within Codex Eldari, you can now ally a patrol of Harlequins very cheaply without breaking your power from pain. Certainly a very solid option with how strong Harlequins are at the moment. Arguably, I would say that Harlequin troops probably do what witches do but a bit better right now, and have a fair bit more general melee damage output and access to tricky stratagems. Not vastly different, but does remain a very strong option for allying. Otherwise, you can also take Corsairs in Drukhari detachments without breaking keywords. The Corsair Void Guard can allow you to get a mini Psyker if you wanted to try some psychic actions or deny the enemy. It can be a nice way to farm up a command point each turn as well, while you maybe have the squad hold down a backfield objective. You can take the Void Reaver troops as well, who have their Strength 4 AP-1 Shuriken rifles. They won't fill your mandatory detachment slots, but if you did just want an extra little bit of fire support in a Raider or Venom, then I think you could do worse than them. They do get OBSEC, even if they don't get any of the other Drukhari bonuses, and certainly give a bit of a challenge to Kabbalite warriors for the same role. Finally, from Forge World, there's two heavy support skimmers, the Tantalus and the Reaper. The Tantalus is 280 points and 18 wounds, so it's one of the bigger models if you did want to focus some synergies on one unit. It also does have a very big transport capacity. On balance, I'm not really sure the 12 strength 8 shots plus the 18 wounds at toughness 7 are really quite worth it for 280 points. I guess the massive transport capacity could be good for multiple units of grotesques maybe. Finally, there's the Reaper, basically a Ravager with a slightly different gun. It costs 160 points for the Ravager's 130, and its damage output is kind of similar, but a bit more swingy. Realistically, aside from liking the model, I'm not sure I'd really run this in comparison to the standard Ravager. In any case, with that said, I think we'll leave that there for the video. I hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion around the Drukhari of Comera, and I look forward to hearing any of your insights down in the comments below. Do you think I've overlooked any important bits about lesser played units, or have I been a bit too generous with some of the rankings of some of the more commonly played stuff? As always, I'm always happy to hear some alternative takes. If you've enjoyed the video, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Making 40k tactics videos every day does take a fair amount of time and effort, particularly really big long ones like this, which do take an awful lot of time to research and compile the slides. If you have enjoyed a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. I do try and give channel patrons some decent rewards, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.